My name is Michael Gasiorek. I'm a senior academic at the University of Sussex. I'm an international trade specialist. I've been working on international trade for 25, 30 years, both as a researcher and doing advisory work to governments and organisations. I also run a small spin-out company from the university called Intranalysis, and Intranalysis is a company that specialises in really understanding trade statistics and how to use trade statistics, and a lot of our work is engaged in helping businesses, organisations, governments, the British government and governments around the world in understanding trade statistics and how to interpret and use those trade statistics to improve your outcomes, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. I'm also a member of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, which is an independent unit established immediately after the referendum at the University of Sussex, designed to engage in the Brexit debate, if you like, designed to try and make sure that the British government, that firms, institutions, organisations make the best possible decisions in terms of moving forward. What I want to do in this talk is think a little bit about how one might consider what the effects of leaving the EU might be and how that might impact on firms, and consider how one might identify what the challenges and opportunities are. For those of you that are at the preceding talk by the Institute of Exports, what I'm going to be saying is extremely complementary to that, and I agree with a lot of what was being said there, but I'm probably slightly less optimistic. So in our title, I've used the term falling off the cliff edge. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is when we leave the EU, leaving the EU involves two things. It involves organising and negotiating the terms of the divorce, how we will leave the EU. Completely separate from that is, do we sign some form of free trade agreement with the EU once we have left the EU? And those two things are legally, technically, completely separate. There is no prenup here, so we do have to organise the divorce from the EU. Separately, we need to organise under what rules will we trade with the EU. If we do not manage to sign a free trade agreement, which is clearly a possibility, then that's what I'm calling, and what has been termed it in the sort of the media, falling off the cliff edge. So in order to think about the implications of this, one needs to identify what does it mean to have market access, both into markets, and for you, if you're an exporting firm, you might be buying supplies from out there, from the EU or non-EU markets, so it's access into the UK market as well as access by exporters to external markets. So I'm going to start my talk by saying a little bit about what matters for market access. I'm going to then apply that to relations with the EU and why and in what way will relations with the EU fundamentally change. Then I'll apply some of that to market access to the rest of the world, and then finish off with some thoughts as to how one might think about identifying export opportunities. So in terms of market access, what matters? Well, I've got one slide on this slide. What matters clearly are going to be costs of trade. If you're an exporting firm, how much it costs you to ship a good from A to B, distance, freight costs, logistics costs, all that is going to matter, as well as trade finance, the terms under which you trade. A lot of that may not be affected by Brexit. Finance issues might be, but I'm not going to go into that. The remaining issues are all issues to do with policy, government policy, which might well impact on and will impact on the way we trade with the EU and with the rest of the world. So, there may be border costs. In other words, there may be border checks at the border. There may be paperwork. There may be taxes on trade that will start to come in with the EU. So currently we trade with the EU with no trade taxes. These now might be introduced and will be introduced if we don't have a free trade agreement. As well as tariff barriers, there's a whole range of other reasons why you might find it difficult, or firms might find it difficult to access other markets. It could be EU markets, it could be non-EU markets. For example, to do with standards. You need to be able to produce, if you want to sell a mobile phone to the US, you can't sell a mobile phone that explodes because you're not meeting the standards. So you might not have access to the US market if you're not producing to the right standards. And there may be things such as rules of origin, which I will come back to shortly. And in all of this, the nature of the supply chain, how firms are integrated into supply chains, both in terms of whether they're suppliers of intermediates or purchasers of intermediates. All of this will matter greatly. So in terms of relations with the EU, just a few statistics. A lot of this has been out there in the press, but it's worth reminding ourselves. Ballpark, just under 50% of everything that the UK imports and exports goes to the EU. The EU is a big deal for us. We do a lot with the EU. Of our trade, roughly 60% of our exports and 75% of our imports are in goods, and the remaining are in services. What that tells you is that both goods and services really matter. Other than the EU, you've got on the slide there what our next most important export partners are, and they're the USA, China, India and Canada. And you've also got which are the most significant sectors in goods that we export. In services, it's financial services and business services. In goods, it's machinery, it's vehicles, it's pharmaceuticals and so on. Okay? So how might relations with the EU change? Well, there's a lot that is unknown. There are some things that are known. The government has announced that we will be leaving the customs union. Why? Because that means, or what is the impact of that? The impact of that is that we can now set up, UK can now set its own tariffs on goods. So currently, if we're importing mobile phones from the US, there will be a tariff, I don't know what it is, let's say it's 5%, hypothetically, it's an import tax of 5%, which is set by the EU. If we are no longer part of the customs union, we are free to set our own tariff on mobile phones. So note, and for complicated reasons which I don't have time to go into, initially what the government is 99.99% certain to do is to levy exactly the same tariffs as currently are the EU tariffs. Okay? There will be no change with regard to imports from rest of the world countries, except that those tariffs may now apply on imports from Germany, France or Italy and any other EU country. So the UK will leave the EU and will be treated as a third country. So leaving the customs union entails that there will now need to be customs declarations. Every exporter will now have to, if you want to export to the EU, will have to file paperwork which they currently don't need to do. Currently, it's pretty much just as easy to export to Paris as it is to Manchester. That will no longer be the case. Okay? There will have to be customs declarations, there will have to be some form of border checks. That doesn't mean that every single lorry will be necessarily checked, every single shipment, but there will have to be some way of managing that trade which we don't have to do at the moment. There may also be tariffs. If we don't sign a free trade agreement, if we fall off the cliff edge, there may well be, or there will be tariffs on our exports to the EU. For some goods, those tariffs are 0. For others, such as cars, they're around 10%. For others, such as some agricultural products, they may be even much higher, 20 or 30%. On average, tariffs are around 5%. The next thing that people often don't understand is this need for rules of origin. Imagine that we do manage to sign a free trade agreement with the EU. What does that mean? It means that in theory, a good produced in the UK can be exported to France without paying a tariff. It will be duty-free. But you have to prove that the good was produced in the UK. You can't just buy in a good from Korea or America, package it up in a little box, nice little box, and ship it to France and say, oh, this is a British good. No, you're not allowed to do that. You have to prove this is a British good. And for every single product that is exported, there will be a rule which says this is the criterion which you have to satisfy to say that this is a British good. Typically, the most common way this is done is, again, take my mobile phone here. This has got bits from all over the world in it. So is this a British phone or a Chinese phone or an American phone? Typically, what you have to do is to prove that a certain proportion of this was made in the UK. And typical proportions are about 40 or 50%. It varies a bit from industry to industry. That means that if you are an exporting firm to the EU, you need to be able to identify, document where you get your parts from, where they're produced from, and what share of that comes from the UK and not the UK, in order to be able to prove that you can export to the EU duty-free. Okay? That costs firms to generate that paperwork. Estimates of those costs range from about 5 or 10%. Okay? Think of a tariff as being 10%, a rules of origin, paperwork, bureaucracy cost is somewhere between 5 and 10% as well. That's going to impact on all firms. The second thing that we know is that we're going to leave the single market. So what I was just talking about was leaving the customs union. The second thing we know is that we're going to leave the single market. Why? Because we want to control migration. And that was a condition of controlling migration between the negotiations, or if you like, the pre-negotiations between the EU and the UK. So the EU said, if you want to control migration, we will not grant you free access to the single market. Why does that matter? The reason that matters is that in the EU, we have the fundamental principle of mutual recognition. What does that mean? It means that any product lawfully sold in one country can be sold in any other country. If I can sell this legally in the UK, I can sell this and I don't need any paperwork to prove this in any EU country. When we leave the EU, that is no longer going to be the case. If I want to sell this phone in France or Germany, I have to prove that I meet the standards in the EU in order to sell that phone. Mutual recognition will be gone unless we manage to renegotiate it somehow in some form of free trade agreement, and believe me, that is not going to be straightforward. So at the moment, the principle of mutual recognition makes it phenomenally much easier for UK firms to export to the EU. That will no longer apply. Lack of access to the single market also will impose much greater restrictions, or is likely to impose much greater restrictions, make it much more difficult for services firms to be able to export, okay, or to trade with the EU. Okay? All those other barriers to exporting, the things that are not tariffs, there are estimates. It's hard to know how much this really costs, but there are estimates of these, and here are some sample estimates across a range of industries. Think of these as being, if this was a tariff, what would be the tariff equivalent? And you can see that they're really quite high. So for example, those extra barriers, regulatory barriers, burdens in transport equipment could be as much as equivalent to a 22% tariff. In textiles, it could be as much as a 19% tariff. So these regulatory barriers, these behind the border barriers, what we economists call non-tariff measures, do matter. Now clearly in a new agreement there may be ways of mitigating against some of these through fancy electronic documentation procedures, trusted trader programs, pseudo customs union rates. There may be ways around this, and we need to think creatively, but we're not going to get rid of those costs entirely. The next thing to say, and I'm going to run through this slide fairly quickly just because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, is that the nature of the supply chain really, really matters in this. There are a lot of UK jobs linked not just to our exports to the EU, but also we're exporting intermediate goods which are then used in EU exports. So we're very closely linked to EU supply chains. We are linked in a very different way, much less closely to the rest of the world's supply chains. And I can go back to this in the questions if anybody's interested. Just to give you a sense of how important the EU is, I said to you earlier that about 50% of what we do is with the EU. Okay. So if you divide up everything that we trade into 97 sectors, out of those 97, for 29 industries, over 70% of what they do is to the EU. So any change in terms of trade with the EU for those 29 industries will have a big impact. For over 70 industries, over 70 of those 97, more than 50% of what they do goes to the EU. So the EU market really matters. Given that we're going to make it more difficult to access to the EU, that makes it even more important to think about liberalising access to other markets. And there are three aspects to this. First of all, we need to regularise our position in the WTO. This is often presented in the media. This is a fallback position. That's what we'll fall back to if we don't have a free trade agreement. That's kind of true, but it makes it seem like it's already in place and it's easy. Turns out that it's not. It's much more difficult than that. We have free access to the EU because we're a member of the EU. There are no tariffs on our exports to the EU. Turns out that the EU has free trade agreements with over 50 other countries. And we therefore, the UK, has access to those 50, it's about 55 countries, duty-free. When we leave the EU, So not only that we will not have access to the EU, we will not have access to those 55 countries, and about 15% of our exports and 15% of our imports are with these countries, unless we sign some agreement with those countries as well. Signing an agreement with the EU does not mean we're signing an agreement with Korea or with any of these other countries that the EU has free trade agreements with. The UK government has said what we're going to do is sign lots and lots of free trade agreements with new destinations, new markets, America, New Zealand, and so on. Okay? So I've got a list there: USA, China, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand. Imagine hypothetically, just because it's a little bit harder to export to the EU, and this is just the statistics, the numbers telling you this, okay? If it's a little bit harder to export to the EU, imagine that exports go down by 1%. You would have to sign a free trade agreement with all those 6 countries, and our exports would have to increase by at least 3% to all those 6 countries just to maintain exports at the same level. That's quite a big ask. In terms of those new free trade agreements, it's important to go back to what I was saying before about the distinction between tariff and non-tariff barriers. Tariffs are not where all the action is. Average tariffs are 5%, 90% of what we export to the US is very, very low tariffs or duty-free. The big barriers are those non-tariff measures that I talked about earlier, and they're typically the areas that are the hardest to negotiate in an agreement. The EU-Canada agreement took 8 years to negotiate. There's a real danger of wanting to sign a quick deal which focuses on tariffs, but that won't be very significant in terms of improving market access. Right, let me finish in the last 5 minutes by thinking a little bit about identifying export opportunities. So, my take on this is Brexit is going to have a big impact, and a big negative impact, so we do have to think about opportunities. It's not just about challenges, it is also about opportunities. How can we identify opportunities? So one way of doing that is use the trade data to work out where you're doing well and where you're not doing well. And there are 2 aspects to this. One aspect of it is this: which industries are we doing well in generally? What are our good industries? And how does that relate to changes in world demand? And this table helps us to think about it. So if you just focus on this bottom left corner, and that's the only one I'm going to focus on here for now, bottom left corner, take everything that we export, take the 200 most significant exports of the UK, and of those, there are 47 sectors where world demand is growing, but their share in our exports is declining. So we're not doing so well in those industries, but world demand is growing. Okay? We can identify that from the trade data. That's a missed opportunity. 47 sectors of missed opportunities. This one is where world demand is growing and UK supply is growing, and there are 102 industries, but out of those 102, for 44 industries, our supply is growing, but not at the same rate as world demand. So actually, they're kind of missed opportunities as well. So there's already 149 industries there, which perhaps policy industries should be focusing on. You can do a similar thing, but focusing on a specific product. So sorry, if I just go back to this slide here, I said there are these 47 missed opportunities. One of those industries, because these are all industries that I'm identifying here, one of those industries happens to be whiskies. So let's think about whiskies and run the same sort of analysis, but now across countries. So what have I got here, that number 25? That's telling you that there are 25 countries, 25 markets where demand for whiskies is growing, but they're becoming less important in UK export of whiskies. That's a missed opportunity for the whiskey industry. There are 65 which we call rising stars, so world demand is growing and we're doing better in those, but of those 65, in nearly 33 cases, whiskey exports are growing at a slower rate than relative world demand is growing. That's kind of also a missed opportunity. So this just illustrates there's an awful lot that you can do with the data to identify where one might be thinking about which are the sectors that matter, which are the countries that matter, and that should help the government, I believe, to help identify priorities in the negotiations. What we then would need to do, to really do this analysis properly, is to work out How many of those industries have tariffs? What are the non-tariff measures, the regulatory measures in those industries? What needs to be negotiated so that negative impact is not so great? Let me finish off with some conclusions. Market access is about much more than tariffs, and often in the press it's talked about just in terms of tariffs. It's not, it's about much more than that. Leaving the exercise is complicated as essentially an exercise in increased bilateral protection, making it more difficult to access each other's markets. Leaving the EU has been described by one commentator rather aptly as trying to take eggs out of an omelette. It's not easy, believe me. Offsetting this negative impact with other developed countries, by trading with other developed countries, will be a challenge. In this context, no deal is a bad deal. So if you think about what Theresa May often says is that no deal is better than a bad deal, well actually no deal is a bad deal. And we should be really clear on that. And that's especially true in a context where the UK is very closely integrated into EU supply chains. It's important to identify the sectors, countries, barriers where there is most scope for increasing trade, and those matrices, if you like, those tables I was putting up earlier, are an example of one way that one can go about trying to practically do that sort of analysis. And finally, it's worth remembering that a free trade area is not free. It's not going to be completely straightforward to trade with the EU, even if we have a free trade area. Thank you very much.